The Whispering Pines community was built around the principle of picturesque, manicured conformity, a vision that hinged entirely on a large, artificial lake. This lake, essential for the community's aesthetics and its underlying irrigation system, was sustained by a modest but critical earthen dam, a structure built years ago by the original developer. Robert's property sat adjacent to this dam. In fact, Robert had inherited not just the house, but the dam itself, as it was technically located on a dedicated land parcel owned by his family since before the development began. He held the original deeds and the permits, and for decades, he had meticulously maintained the structure, ensuring its stability and the health of the reservoir it held back. His maintenance was a quiet, thankless service that preserved the multi-million-dollar view for the entire neighborhood, and he had never asked the HOA for a penny. However, the current iteration of the Whispering Pines HOA was not concerned with history or practical utility, it was concerned only with power and procedure. Specifically, it was obsessed with a paltry sum of $350 in architectural review fees that Robert had refused to pay. The fees were related to a minor, code-compliant repair he had made to his deck, a repair the HOA had initially approved, then inexplicably decided required a new, non-refundable filing fee months after the work was complete. Robert, citing the initial approval and the absurdity of the retroactive charge, had stonewalled them. This refusal, though small, became a symbolic affront to the HOA's president, Mr. Sterling, a man whose ego was inversely proportional to his actual authority. Sterling saw Robert's defiance as a direct challenge to his iron-fisted governance of the neighborhood. Sterling's response was immediate and wildly disproportionate. He used the unpaid fee as pretext to declare Robert a non-compliant member, and then, in a spectacularly reckless move, Sterling leveraged the HOA's vague power over common areas to assert ownership over the dam. Ignoring decades of property deeds and utility records, Sterling claimed the dam, because it served the common lake, was common property and therefore subject to HOA jurisdiction. He framed the issue not as a property dispute, but as a maintenance problem caused by Robert's deliberate neglect and failure to comply with financial obligations. He convened an emergency, closed-door board meeting, presenting a fabricated narrative that the dam was an imminent structural liability that needed immediate intervention, citing Robert's non-payment as proof of his unwillingness to maintain the necessary common infrastructure. The board, terrified of legal repercussions and trusting Sterling's bluster, voted to execute corrective action. Sterling then drafted an official-looking, but completely illegal, notice. The notice declared the dam an unapproved structure that needed modification due to the non-payment of fees and the alleged structural hazard. It gave Robert 48 hours to pay the $350 or face the demolition of the dam's ancillary spillway structure, which Sterling erroneously believed would fix the alleged structural issue. Robert received the notice with disbelief. He immediately contacted his lawyer, who assured him the HOA had zero authority over his titled land, let alone the federally permitted water control structure on it. They drafted a cease and desist letter, explicitly warning the HOA of the catastrophic hydrological and legal consequences of touching the dam. Robert delivered the letter personally to Sterling's immaculate front porch. Sterling, smug in his authority, ripped the letter in half without reading it. "Your threats are noted, Mr. Harrison. But your dam will be mitigated. Perhaps you should have simply paid your fees." Sterling had already hired a small, local excavating company, misleading the owner into believing the dam was simply a large, unauthorized dirt berm on HOA property that needed to be lowered for drainage. At dawn, while the community was still asleep, a large bulldozer rumbled onto the dam. Robert woke to the sound of grinding metal and hurried outside, phone in hand. He found Sterling and two board members standing nearby, observing the operation with grim satisfaction. The bulldozer was already carving a large, ugly gash into the earthen structure near the spillway, exactly where the water pressure was highest. The small gap immediately began to widen under the force of the lake water, which was now rushing through the breach. Robert screamed at Sterling, "You idiot! That's not a berm. That's a structural dam. You've compromised the integrity. Stop them now." Sterling simply smiled, a thin, cruel gesture. "It's already done, Mr. Harrison. And you should have paid your /350. Robert, realizing the physical destruction was irreversible, knew the game was over. The dam's material was mostly loose earth, and once the breach started, the outflowing water acted as its own unstoppable excavator, tearing away at the sides. The reservoir, which had taken months of rain to fill, was now violently emptying. Robert stepped back, pulling out his camera to document the reckless order and the beginning of the inevitable disaster. The dam, destroyed over a petty fee, was releasing its pent-up energy, and that energy was about to reshape the entire landscape of Whispering Pines. The sight of the bulldozer carving into the dam was immediately followed by the terrifying sound of water achieving a violent, unexpected freedom. The initial cut made by the excavator was a relatively small slit in the earthen structure, but within seconds, the pressure from the artificial lake took over. The water, held captive for years to maintain the manicured beauty of Whispering Pines, surged through the opening. The soil, already saturated and loosened by the digging, offered minimal resistance. The breach didn't just grow, it exploded, the water tearing away massive chunks of earth from the dam's sides, transforming the small channel into a yawning, muddy canyon. The roar was deafening, a geological sound of chaos that drowned out the grinding of the machinery and Robert's panicked shouts. Robert watched, immobilized by a sickening mixture of rage and grim realization. The lake level dropped visibly by the minute, and the volume of water rushing through the rapidly widening hole was staggering. Mr. Sterling, the HOA president, stood by for a few moments, his face initially set in a smug smirk of accomplishment. But as the roar intensified and the ground began to tremble faintly, even his colossal arrogance faltered. The contractors, seeing the sheer power of the water and realizing they were no longer dealing with a simple drainage berm but a structural catastrophe, hastily retreated, scrambling to get their heavy equipment off the collapsing bank before they were pulled into the torrent. Sterling and the two accompanying board members stumbled backward, their petty triumph dissolving into palpable fear. The geography of Whispering Pines, so carefully curated for maximum property value, was now the community's greatest vulnerability. The lake was located at the highest elevation of the development, and the water's natural flow path, the one that had been carefully managed by the dam, followed the central drainage valley directly through the neighborhood's most expensive real estate. This was the valley where the common amenities, the clubhouse, the tennis courts, and the beautifully landscaped Central Park were situated. The water, now unleashed, carved a new, instantaneous river, a muddy, turbulent force heading straight for the heart of the community. Within 15 minutes of the breach, the main flow hit the Central Valley. It wasn't just a flood, it was a flash flood carrying silt, uprooted shrubs, and the debris of the collapsing dam. The decorative footbridges spanning the narrow, dry creek beds were the first victims, splintering under the pressure. The carefully tended greenways became muddy torrents. The water volume was immense, forcing the flow far beyond the usual drainage channels. Robert drove his truck, racing ahead of the surging water, laying on the horn to wake up the residents who lived closest to the valley floor. He passed houses where the lower-level windows were already becoming targets for the rapidly rising tide. The epicenter of the disaster quickly became the HOA clubhouse. A structure built low in the valley near a small, decorative pond, the clubhouse was designed to overlook the scenic waters. Now, the scenic waters were attacking it. The torrent swept into the pond, overran its banks, and slammed against the clubhouse foundation. The ground floor quickly succumbed, the glass doors shattering as the water rushed in, turning the impeccably maintained banquet hall into a swirling mess of mud and water. The disaster wasn't just superficial, the speed and weight of the water created serious erosion. The water was not only flooding the land, it was actively sinking it, washing away the underlying soil that stabilized the foundations. Sterling and the board members, now soaked and covered in mud, arrived on the scene in utter panic, watching the destruction unfold from a slight rise overlooking the Central Park. Sterling, his voice hoarse, tried desperately to call emergency services, but the damage was already done. The lake was emptying too fast for any external agency to intervene. They could only watch as the Central Park, with its expensive paving stones and fountains, began to subside. The water was undercutting the artificial landscape, causing large sections of the pavement to crack and tilt. It was clear that the structural integrity of the land itself was being compromised. The true moment of reckoning came when the water reached the foundation of the cluster of high-value homes built closest to the Central Valley. These houses, sitting on shallow foundations common in modern developments, offered little resistance to the hydrostatic forces now pressing down and washing out the supporting earth. A large crack appeared on the stucco wall of the house nearest the submerged clubhouse, widening rapidly. A sickening groan echoed across the valley before the corner of the house visibly sagged a few inches, a clear sign that the soil supporting the structure had been completely washed away. It was a terrifying, physical manifestation of the HOA's destructive short-sightedness. The water, unmanaged and powerful, had delivered immediate and ruinous retribution. The pettiness over /350 had resulted in millions of dollars in structural damage and the instantaneous creation of a sprawling, sinking disaster zone right in the middle of their pristine suburban paradise. Robert looked at Sterling, who was staring blankly at the destruction of his community, and saw not triumph, but the cold, hard certainty of the legal tsunami that was about to follow the flood. The immediate torrent subsided, leaving behind a scene of utter, muddy devastation. Where the manicured lake had been, there was now a vast expanse of exposed, slippery lake bed, scattered with dead fish and debris. The Central Valley of Whispering Pines, once the aesthetic heart of the community, resembled a war zone. The clubhouse was a sodden wreck, its lower level choked with silt, and the tennis courts were fractured concrete slabs floating in thick mud. But the most terrifying damage was structural. Several homes along the valley floor were visibly compromised. Foundations had shifted, yards had collapsed into sinkholes where the rushing water had scoured away the subsoil, and the house nearest the demolished dam, the one that had groaned during the flood, now stood listing at a disconcerting angle, its value reduced to zero in a matter of hours. Robert stood on the high ground, documenting every angle with his camera, no longer feeling triumph, only a detached, heavy sense of finality. The water had been a force of nature, the ensuing legal storm would be a force of human accountability. The police and fire departments had arrived, followed swiftly by county emergency management officials who immediately classified the Central Valley as a disaster area and evacuated the compromised homes. As the chaos began to organize, Robert was quickly approached by a grim-faced state water regulatory agent. After reviewing Robert's documentation, the original deeds, the state dam permits, and the HOA's reckless demolition notice, the agent's expression confirmed the severity of the legal situation. The HOA, and specifically its leadership, had violated federal and state regulations governing water control structures, an offense far graver than any petty property dispute. The legal tsunami began within 24 hours. The initial wave was from the residents themselves. The owners of the damaged homes, many of whom had been loyal, dues-paying members of the HOA, realized they were facing uninsured losses, as most standard policies do not cover damage caused by deliberately reckless community actions or structural soil failure due to human-caused flooding. They retained a class action law firm specializing in property liability and gross negligence. Robert, armed with the signed cease and desist letter and his photographic proof of Sterling ordering the demolition, became their star witness. The lawsuit named the HOA as an entity, the board members individually, and most specifically, President Sterling, holding them jointly and severally liable for the millions of dollars in property destruction. Mr. Sterling, the man who had torn up Robert's legal warning, now found his entire life collapsing. The HOA's insurance policy, designed to cover basic liability for pool accidents or slip and falls, immediately denied the multi-million-dollar claims, citing the exclusion for intentional or criminal acts resulting in ecological disaster and structural failure. The insurance company essentially argued that Sterling's order to demolish a dam over /350 was not a covered operational mistake, but an act of gross, deliberate malfeasance. The community's financial reserves, intended for pool repairs and landscaping, were instantly wiped out by initial legal fees, leaving the HOA bankrupt within a week. The financial pressure was agonizing. Sterling's assets, and those of the other board members who had voted for the corrective action, were immediately frozen pending the lawsuit. Sterling's own home, one of the most expensive in Whispering Pines, was now almost worthless, located perilously close to the newly created, unstable ravine that replaced the dam. His obsession with the minor fee had resulted in the complete and utter destruction of the community's financial health and his own personal solvency. The dream of the manicured suburb was over, replaced by a landscape of caution tape, sinking homes, and legal summonses. Robert, meanwhile, found himself in a complex but ultimately vindicated position. His lawyer successfully petitioned the state to declare the land parcel containing the ruined dam site a federally mandated remediation zone, securing its protection from any further interference. While he was absolved of any blame, Robert did not celebrate. The victory was too costly, the sight of his neighbors' ruined homes too sobering. The true irony was the fate of the community. With the dam gone, the lake, the centerpiece and primary driver of property value, could not be refilled without a massive, multi-million-dollar construction project, an expense the now bankrupt HOA could never afford. The aesthetic continuity Sterling had fought so viciously to protect had literally sunk, leaving behind an ugly, muddy basin that permanently devalued every home in Whispering Pines. The dam, which Robert had diligently maintained for years, was the only thing holding the community together, both physically and financially. Once removed for the pettiest of reasons, the entire neighborhood began to crumble, a stark and ruinous example of what happens when petty tyranny meets an immovable force of nature. The HOA had watched their suburbs sink, and now they would face the devastating consequences of rebuilding it from the legal and financial depths.